Welcome to the Asbestos Knowledge Empire.
What does asbestos management mean to you?
I used to really struggle with the asbestos management at my site, but now it's a breeze.
It used to be really expensive. I was paying loads, but now I've got my asbestos power team in place. It's so much easier.
Asbestos can be a pain in the arse if not handled right.
We had to stop the job because asbestos was discovered. Now we don't have that problem.
Asbestos management is easier than you think. Asbestos management. Be proactive, not reactive. Think about asbestos first, not last.
And now your hosts, best-selling authors and asbestos experts, Ian Stone and Neil Munro.
Welcome to the Asbestos Knowledge Empire. I'm Ian Stone.
I'm Neil Munro.
So today we're talking about deciding and how to decide whether asbestos works are licensable or not.
Yeah. So this is information usually is contained within Regulation 2 of the Control of Asbestos Regulations. We actually look at the Approved Code of Practice, which is L143. There's kind of detailed explanations about how the contractor or the person who's planning the work should assess whether those works are likely to be licensable or not.
Now, the things held within the regulations and L143 and, well, anything to do with asbestos, it's always, it's difficult to wade through, right? It's not an easy read. It's not an easy roll off the tongue piece. But if you did want to have a look at L143, if you go on the HC website, you can download a copy of this, the document that we're talking about and the paragraphs that we're going to be talking about, so that you may want to listen to the podcast, go off, get a copy of that, read it, re-listen to the podcast, and then reread it again. Because sometimes, like I say, it's difficult to walk through because it's a complicated subject, right? And we do always try our best to simplify things so that anybody can understand, because at the end of the day, if everybody understands where we're at with asbestos, then exposures are going to be less and people will be compliant more. But yeah, that was just a side note. If you want a copy, you can get a copy, like I say, but it's not a...
It's not an easy sort of thing to determine.
You can't digest it.
If you're outside of kind of the industry.
Yes, exactly that. And that's yeah.
And it's really, the emphasis is on the employer to make that assessment. So usually the licensed contractor, but also for non-licensed contractor, they should make this assessment.
Yes.
To determine whether their works are non-licensed, to confirm that fact.
100%, because a lot of the time people will go, oh, it's asbestos cement, it's non-licensed.
Yes.
Which isn't the case.
No, there's no clear, you can do this type of work.
To that.
Any which way you want to, and it's always going to be non-licensed. So we just wanted to kind of run through, just give a brief overview and flavour of
how the decisions are made, how it's got to, and the things that people need to consider.
So when looking at what licensable work, again, licensable work with asbestos is contained in the Regulation 2, and it's defined as work which the first criteria is where the worker exposure to asbestos is not sporadic and of low intensity.
Okay,
so what does that mean?
Sporadic and low intensity. Yeah, that's not an everyday
terminology.
No, not at all.
So sporadic and low intensity exposure. Now this is defined as an exposure which is 0.6 fibres per cubic centimetre in an air measured over a 10-minute period. Any exposure which exceeds or is liable to exceed this is not sporadic and of low intensity.
Okay, so we've got a level there which is 0.6, and the way that would be determined would be to carry out a personal air sampling of the operative carrying out that work.
Yeah.
But again, it's not one of those things that you want to have a go at and then find that you've failed dramatically, because by that point it's too late. So this is where using experts and businesses that do this day in and day out can assist you with how they get to that point, because over the last however many years, asbestos removal companies have built up a catalogue of personal air sampling and monitoring that they've had carried out during projects, and some of these will be tests that they've done within enclosures, and that's how it allows them to kind of determine the perhaps perceived borderline or, oh, I think that would be licensable or not. They can determine that because they've carried these tests out under controlled circumstances.
Yeah. And the kind of the overriding caveat to that is if you don't know, you have to put in the correct measures to determine, to take that into account.
Yes.
So there's no kind of, we're not sure. You have to prove it the other way.
Exactly. You can't say, oh, well, I think it's going to be that. We'll be all right, Jack.
Yeah.
Crack on. You then find out that you've broken the regulation.
Yeah. And this is kind of in there too. There is occasions where a licensed contractor can do emergency works, or a contractor can do emergency works. And this is to kind of prevent any kind of, high exposure works being carried out without a license.
Yeah.
There could be an emergency situation. And this, if it's going to exceed that sort of that height of that, and that is quite a flash exposure, isn't it? It mustn't exceed that across the board.
And that's it. I mean, even throughout the works, that's not like exposure over the period of works. That's during the work. So it could be for 5 minutes, a minute, a second even. It can't exceed that level of 0.6 fibres per centimetre cubed.
So the next one is where the risk assessment cannot clearly demonstrate that the control limit of 0.1 fibres per centimetre cubed, airborne fibres averaged over a 4-hour period will not be exceeded. Okay, so this is now where we're talking about the personal exposure to the employees carrying out the works, and it mustn't exceed that 0.1 over 4 hours. So again, now it can fluctuate up and down, but averaged over the 4-hour period, it shouldn't go above that.
And
0.1.
again, the only way to determine it is to have personal air sampling done on the operative working. But as it's part of the risk assessment is to assess how you're going to carry out those works to kind of make sure that you're not going to exceed that level, and what are you doing to also make sure that you're trying not to exceed the level, i.e. looking at other things such as dampening the material down, using hand tools only rather than drills and powered tools, things like that.
Yeah, so you have got a kind of the height of the 0.6. So like any flash exposure can't go over that 0.6, but then averaged over the 4 hours in total, you have to keep it under 0.1.
And let's be honest, when you think about a job, even an emergency job, it always takes doing something properly and correctly with asbestos. It's never 10 minutes because you've got all of the setup to undertake. You've got to have all the control measures in place. You have to have the area sealed off or screened off. And even that alone, that's all part of these works. Then carrying out the works and cleaning up afterwards and all the rest of it. So you've got to think that it's not the kind of 0.6 really is a high number. However, we're already talking about it's got to be a lot lower over that period. And that period is likely to be over a few hours.
Yeah. I think the important kind of words in this number 2, second one, is the assessment cannot clearly demonstrate. So you have to clearly demonstrate that. That's really important. If you haven't got the evidence, as you sort of touched on earlier, you haven't got the evidence that you can carry out the works satisfactorily, then you have to presume it's licensable.
And that's the thing. That's the difference between theory and evidence. So the only way to demonstrate, you can't demonstrate with a theory that you think it's going to be all right. You can only demonstrate with proof that you've got knowledge of this and it's proven, your work methods and processes are proven that you're not going to exceed this because you've got that proof of personal air monitoring from a similar scenario or a similar test from previous.
Yeah, and it's kind of a catch-22 situation because you could only prove it if you've got all the controls in place, i.e. you've got a licence.
Yeah.
And you've got everything in place to then negate the need for it to be a licensed activity. Maybe you could use a secondary contractor to prove that element, a licensed contractor to test your work method, and you've got air monitoring and all the controls in place and the evidence to back that up, that it then becomes non-licensed. But again, it's, having those, the evidence to back that up. So on asbestos coating, surface coatings which contain asbestos for fire protection, heat insulation, or sound insulation, but not including textured coatings. Okay, so this is clearly defining that you need a license, an asbestos license to work with asbestos, to work on asbestos coatings, which have been used for fire protection, heat insulation, and sound insulation.
Yeah, so I mean, just some examples of that would be insulation.
Yeah, it's quite clear cut, isn't it?
Yes, it's just insulation that's used.
Yeah, on your survey report, if it's been deemed as insulation and that's been used for heat or fire protection or even sound insulation, it is a licensed material.
Yeah, so that could be stuff in your boiler room to pipe work, insulation to pipes, insulation to anything like that. Really, like you say, it's clearly defined, and what it's also clearly defining it isn't, which is the texture coating. So if you think of the stippled finishes, decorative finishes that people have in their homes, that's excluded from this. So that's the clear line of what is insulation versus what's not, which is texture coating.
Yeah. I think there's key words of fire protection, heat insulation, and sound insulation. Yeah. They're the kind of key words. So moving on to the next one, on asbestos insulation or ALB or asbestos insulating board, where the risk assessment demonstrates that the work is not sporadic and of low intensity, the control limit will be exceeded and is not a short duration work. Okay, so for this one, it's kind of not specifying, specifics on the use of it. It's kind of including insulation ALB, where the risk assessment demonstrates that the work's not sporadic and low intensity and that the control limit will be exceeded. Okay, so really there's quite a few criteria there. And again, non-licensed contractors should be taking this into account. This is not just a licence activity. It's not just for licensed contractors to prove whether their works are licensed. It's everyone.
Yeah, it's to prove that your works aren't rather than are.
So all the appropriate, controls are taken into account. We can give you kind of some examples of licensable work and non-licensed work, which are detailed within the approved code of practice. So if we take work which requires a licence from the HSC, example one is removing spray coatings or limpet asbestos. Okay, yep. So again, if you take that into account, it is a spray coating. Generally, that would have been used for fire protection and even sound.
Yeah, definitely
sound insulation.
Yeah.
So that's kind of going to fall into that, and it is a very friable material. Working on removing that, even under the strictest of control conditions,
that's licensed every day of the week.
It's highly likely you're going to exceed the control limit, even with strict wetting conditions and wetting that material. It's just so friable, isn't it? It's such a high asbestos content. Yeah, you definitely need a licensed contractor for that. Next one is removal of other work which may disturb pipe lagging. I think there's a key word there of removal or other work which may disturb pipe lagging. It's not even saying you're stripping it or repairing it.
No, it's just the possibility of disturbance.
Yeah. Again, going back to pipe insulation, it's used for heat, isn't it? Heat protection. Asbestos insulation or lagging has got quite a high content of asbestos. If it's disturbed, it's likely to give off quite a high fibre exposure from that.
Definitely, it's a high amount of asbestos mixed within the actual insulation mix. Like you say, it's for kind of the heat protection insulation purposes. A lot of the time, pipes would be lagged within the boiler room, but then when they shoot off around the school or the office, they would then be unlagged because they were happy for it to lose the heat in those areas, because essentially that's kind of backing up the radiators. But in the areas they didn't want it to lose heat, that's where it was lagged.
Any work involving loose fill insulation?
Again,
it's the risk of that material. Work on millboard.
Yeah.
Again, millboard is even softer than asbestos insulating board. Again, it's got quite a high asbestos content, and again, removing or working on that material is liable to give off quite a significant fibre release.
It makes me shudder just as we go through these. It just made me actually genuinely shudder thinking about somebody going off and working on these who isn't licensed, and that people might have that I think I'll be all right. Yeah, it'll be okay scenario. And it's like, no way. These are just not products that you can have a go at or think that you're going to be all right with.
Here's an interesting one.
Go on.
Cleaning up significant quantities of loose/fine debris containing ACM dust where the work is not sporadic and low intensity, the control limit will be exceeded, or is not short duration work. So that's not actually
it's not a material.
It's not defining the product.
No, that's what I was going to say. It's not the product. It's not the material that we've just spoken about. You can't define that. Oh, that's insulation or that's lagging or whatever. It's just debris that contains asbestos fibre.
Fine debris. Now, that fine debris may possibly have come from spray coatings, insulation, insulating boards.
And the likelihood it has.
Yes.
But you might not.
Commonly, it would be, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
However, you could easily get fine dust from a product like asbestos cement.
100%.
And we've actually seen that. Mm-hmm. Where asbestos cement roofs have been washed down or
treated with the chemicals that remove the moss, but that also delaminates them a little bit. We've seen them where they've jet washed to clean off. Again, that delaminates it and creates a slurry of asbestos fibre that kind of, as it dries out, you can literally see raw asbestos fibre. Another one for asbestos cement is asbestos cement that's been in the fire, where it delaminates from the heat. Little pieces flake off and just float around and then settle. We've seen that on car parks, outside of offices where the roof was that old and that fragile. It didn't have to have jet washing, chemical attack, or even fire. It had just delaminated because it was that brittle and ruined that just the wind blowing it blew asbestos fibres off into the car park.
Yeah. So, we've all of a sudden we've taken what's in most people's eyes a non-licensed material, and suddenly it's become a licensed activity to kind of rectify it and remediate it. So that's an interesting one to kind of consider. And it's not all kind of the important message to take away from this is it's not just be kind of pigeonholed into looking at the product.
No,
it's how the product, the condition it's in, how it's going to be dealt with needs to be considered, and what's the likely exposure from carrying out those works needs to be taken into account. So final example for licensed work on AIB or asbestos insulating board where the risk assessment indicates that it will not be of short duration. Mm-hmm. Okay, so asbestos insulating board, again, it's got quite a high asbestos content. It can be soft material.
Yeah.
It's slightly harder than most of what you'd class as the insulation and the boards. So it's kind of a little bit harder than that. But again, breaking that, drilling that, working on that material in general can give off a significant fibre release.
Definitely. With AIB, it's the one...
particularly unsealed.
Yeah, and that's what I was just going to say. I mean, in this country, we used a hell of a lot of asbestos insulating board throughout all sorts of buildings. Offices, homes, schools, hospitals, literally everywhere we've used it. And throughout my career in asbestos, I've seen a hell of a lot of asbestos insulating board that's unsealed. Now, you could literally show a lay person an asbestos insulating board that's unsealed, and with the naked eye, you can see all the amosite brown asbestos fibres in it. Normally it contains amosite brown and crosstile white asbestos or a mixture. It can contain any number of the asbestos fibres, but they're kind of the main ones. But yeah, with the fibres, you can literally see the brown asbestos fibres sticking out like in little bundles. And again, it's kind of, it's not as soft as, like you say, the lagging and stuff, but it's not a hard, dense board. It's not bonding those fibres really well within the matrix. The fact that, like I say, you can look at an unsealed board and see the fibres poking out with the naked eye just shows you how much asbestos is in that board. Yeah, there's a crazy amount. And again, that's why the majority of works on asbestos insulating board always fall into that licensed category.
Yeah. I think it's the risk from working on that material. If a contractor was remediating it, not strictly removing the asbestos insulating board, but I don't know, maybe encapsulating it, maybe patching a hole or something like that. Yeah, it's possible to do that without exceeding the control limit. However, the risk of if something does go wrong, you're going to then potentially exceed the control limit.
Definitely.
If you go to repair this hole or encapsulate it, and suddenly the board snaps,
you're in a whole world of pain.
You're likely to have exceeded the control limit at that point in time.
And the thing is as well, when you compare asbestos insulating board to asbestos pipe lagging, for instance, pipe lagging, when it's injected, it does soak up the water and become sodden. To get an asbestos insulating board to be that kind of dampened down and to collect that water so that fibres are held, that's difficult. Because you can't inject it. So it's a hell of a lot of spraying.
Your surface saturating it, really, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly that. And that's the thing. So, and also I think people are more inclined to have a go at just fixing that damaged tile or damaged board or something, because that's more in the kind of day-to-day remit of most builders, really, of, oh, can you replace this board? Can you do this? Yeah, that's fine, no worries. Cracked, things like that. Whereas lagging and stuff, that's kind of not a run-of-the-mill repair. You don't get laggers that will just, oh yeah, I can. It's not like a normal job. Whereas just doing a repair on a piece of AIB, that falls more into the remit of, like I say, builders, handymen, that type of thing.
Decorators is one where, you think decorators are good at filling holes, aren't they, on walls and stuff like that. And it's easy to mistake that you can do that with ALB. And again, if that crack turns into a break, it's a world of pain.
And we've found that over the years that's happened with like handy persons at schools and things like that, caretakers. It is more of the, I thought I could scenario, because like I say, I think it's easier in the mind to just, I've just got to pop to Screwfix or Travis to pick up some bits and then I can do it.
Yeah, even if I've had a bit of non-licensed training, I'm good to go on that. I've assessed it, and but I don't assess it right.
Yeah, exactly. One other thing on this, we've spoken about licenses and the fact of being licensed versus non-licensed. I just think it'd be good to clarify what a license is and where a license comes from. So to become a licensed asbestos removal contractor, you need to request permission. It's a permissioned regime, a permissioned industry in the UK, and you have to put an application into the Health and Safety Executive along with a fee that you pay them to assess you as a company. And what the HC do, they assess you to make sure you've got all the things we've spoken about in place, make sure you've got correct PPE, RPE, so personal protective equipment and respiratory protective equipment, make sure you've got all the correct plans of works in place, the risk assessments, correct insurances. Essentially, the license check is to make sure that you are competent and you're competent to carry out these works, because it's dangerous work. And that's why it's a permissioned industry. The other permissioned industries in the UK are working with nuclear power and also explosives. So for explosives like demolition and stuff, again, you can't just pop to your local hardware shop and buy some TNT and have a little go at blowing it up, because it's dangerous. And that is where asbestos sits within our country. And that's why, because it is dangerous when it goes wrong. So those are... to become a licensed asbestos contractor, you have a lot of hoops to jump through to make sure that you are okay to trade. Essentially, when you get that license, it's your license to trade.
Yeah.
And then throughout that period of you having that license, you have to notify the Health and Safety Executive when and where you're working. And when they receive these notifications, they book you in for audits to come and make sure that what you said originally is actually happening. And if they find something wrong, well, guess what? You lose your license and you can even be taken to court, fined, prison, whatever. So that's the level of permission and kind of the responsibility that permission holders carry with them. It's a lot of weight to carry to work with asbestos.
It's an interesting one as well, because actually non-licensed contractors believe, or some believe, that a lot of the asbestos regulations won't apply to them. But it's actually the opposite. 90% of all their asbestos regulations will still apply, even if you undertake a non-licensed works. It's only the element around the licensing, and that the licensed contractor must obviously, additionally, on top of all the other stuff, has to comply with.
Yeah, that's the thing. Just because it's got the word asbestos in it, people go, "Oh, it's not nothing to do with me." But no, it's all about you, and that's the whole point with all the regulations.
Exactly, they still have to comply with all the others. So to give you some examples of non-licensed then, and again, these are details in the ACOP. So work which does not usually, and that's the key word, require a licence. They're not actually saying, yes, you can crack on, because they still emphasise you still have to do that assessment. Just because it says here, they'll still be looking for that assessment and the evidence to prove, that either way it's licensed and non-licensed. So short duration maintenance tasks where the control limits will not be exceeded. Okay, so again, you need to have the evidence. You need to have the evidence that the works that you're planning to do, if you're a non-licensed contractor, are not going to exceed the control limit. It's no good just going, I thought it was. You have to have the evidence to prove it. So removing textured decorative coatings by any suitable dust reducing method. Okay, so that's descript in that. So the reason why there's a couple of emphasis on textured coatings in these sort of paragraphs within the approved code of practice is that previously textured coating was a licensed activity, wasn't it? So that's kind of why there's more clarification around textured coatings.
Yeah, textured coating used to be treated in exactly the same way as
coating.
Yeah, lagging, spray coating, all the rest of it.
Yeah, because it was the word coating.
Yeah.
Which kind of confused matters. So yeah, that's why there's a bit more clarification on that. So decorative coatings, which you'd probably know as Artex on ceilings, walls, they usually are non-licensed. Next one is cleaning up small quantities of loose, fine debris containing ACM dust where the work is sporadic and low intensity. The control limit will not be exceeded and is of short duration.
So this is the same as what we spoke about earlier, but totally opposite at the same time.
Yeah. So this is maybe, I don't know, there's a tiny bit of dust from, I don't know, an asbestos board on a wall that's just dropped on the floor. It's literally just a small tiny nugget, just needs a quick clean up. A non-licensed contractor could do that, and that's a quick repair and clean up. Yeah,
again, that's if they've got everything all in place, they've assessed it, because again, it's kind of like they're saying, the beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Looking at the job from one person and looking at the job from another person, you will see two different jobs, because somebody might look at it and say, well, there's only that little bit. However, an experienced licensed contractor would know that, okay, that yes, there's a small lump. However, that board's hit the floor. That would have brought out more dust and fibre that, again, you can't see with the naked eye until you get to that point of clearing it up and wiping the area down fully. And that's the point. It's kind of, it just, for anybody assessing it, they really do need to be experienced in assessing it to make sure they're making that right decision. Because if you look at a job and say, oh, well, it's only that little bit, it'll be fine. Well, you might be doing more harm than good, because once asbestos fibre's spread, it is just spread and that's it. And you might not clear it all up. You might not give the room and the area the proper clean down that it actually needs to remove the asbestos fibre in that scenario.
Next one is work on asbestos cement products or other materials containing asbestos, such as paints, bitumen resins, rubbers, etc., where the fibres are bound in the matrix, which prevents most of them being released. So again, this is kind of describing lower risk asbestos items, which the asbestos fibre is bound within the secondary material, in the matrix of that other material. So it's harder for the fibres to be released into the air because of the nature of the secondary material that they're bound in.
Yeah, and I mean, all those, just by hearing them bitumen, you know what that's like. That's a sticky material. You are going to bind fibres within rubber, again, anything within that is going to be bound within the rubber. So it's those types of products.
Yeah, and again, all you need to take into account is the removal method and how that's going to be removed, because just because it is asbestos content, low asbestos content, and it's bound within the secondary material, depending on your work and removal method will depend on the fibre release.
Definitely.
And it's all these elements that need to be taken into account.
Yeah, I mean, along with those, like if you consider floor tiles, they're along that kind of same line, so that they're a lower kind of asbestos content. It's a dense material. It could have asbestos floor glue that's glued them down. Again, that's a material where the fibre is going to be bound within. However, when you start taking a diamond floor sander or sanding the floor or grinding the floor, you're then changing everything. And obviously, when you're doing that, you're damaging the matrix of the material. So therefore, the fibres aren't going to stay bound within that. You will be damaging it. You will be releasing it. So again, it's a lower scale in people's minds. However, you must consider what is being done to it, because that can change it on literally in an instant.
Exactly. And the kind of final one is work associated with collecting and analysing samples to identify the presence of asbestos. Okay, so you don't actually need a licence to go and collect samples to get them analysed for asbestos presence.
However, with that, again, it doesn't mean any Tom, Dick or Harry can go and do it. You still need to be trained and competent to do it, so that you're not exposing yourself, you're not releasing asbestos fibre to expose others. So again, even though it's considered non-licensed, you still need that training, and you still need to know what you're doing to be able to collect those samples in an appropriate manner.
Yeah, exactly. All the other asbestos regulations will apply. As you said, the training, appropriate training, appropriate PPE, appropriate risk assessments, appropriate working methods, appropriate certified equipment. And that applies to any work with asbestos, including us doing samples and collecting samples.
Definitely. And you know a biggie where most people fail? Insurance. Because insurances always exclude asbestos works as part of their standard terminology for anyone, builders, roofers, carpenters, electricians, literally anyone. It's always in there and it's excluded, because insurers know the risk from asbestos and know that the people they're insuring shouldn't be doing this work unless they've got everything else in place. So again, that's another biggie, because if it does go wrong, it goes wrong in a big way. So therefore, the first port of call for me to cover my own arse would be make sure that the company I'm using is insured. And if they're not, well, guess what? They're not going to be able to do it, because if they've not got insurance, they haven't got anything else that we've mentioned.
Yeah, exactly. So there was just some examples on the HC I've provided in the proof code of practice. Again, emphasis on work which requires a license. So quite descript there. You got to have a license to do those. Where it's a little bit less clear is work which does not usually require a license from the HC. So it's just bearing that in mind. It's not clear cut on the non-licensed element. There's always other factors which could push it over into the licensed. Great, I hope you found that useful. If you do need any assistance, any help, any advice, you've got a project coming up and you're kind of not sure whether it's going to be licensed or non-licensed, and you're looking for some advice, reach out to us. We're more than happy to kind of give you a consultancy advice on that, and obviously guide you in the appropriate way to selecting the right contractor for your works. Okay, remember, asbestos first, not last.